This video contains full spoilers for the boss battles and the story of Marvel's Spider-Man 2, so be warned. Spider-Man rivals Batman for the single best rogues gallery in comics, and as such, like Batman, has nearly endless potential for boss battles in his games. Marvel's Spider-Man 2's base game doesn't disappoint in that regard, with 12 boss battles across the game, and in this video, I'll be ranking all of them. The criteria for this ranking obviously includes the gameplay of the boss battle, as well as the difficulty level, but in my opinion, there is more to consider in regards to what makes a good boss battle good. There's the visual aspect, including the villain's design, the arena, the graphics, and the colors. There are the story aspects, whether that be the fight's placement in the story, the build up to it, its intensity, or at times even emotion, and there's simply how well the villain was pulled off in regards to their design, their abilities, and their rivalry with the hero. Keeping all that in mind, make sure to subscribe, like this video, leave your own list in the comments, and let's begin. The most difficult normal enemy for Spider-Man in the game, the symbiote Behemoth, is a boss battle for Mary Jane at the tail end of her final gameplay segment, and it's the only one in the game that I don't think is very good. You can also argue that it isn't even a boss battle, but because it does have a health bar and is the single most powerful enemy that MJ goes up against, I decided to include it. MJ's gameplay is certainly a lot better and a lot more fun than the previous game, especially in this final segment where she gets the sonic gun to fight symbiotes, as it feels like some sort of third-person zombie shooter horror game, but even then, it doesn't come anywhere close to comparing to the Spider-Man combat, which is done so well and sets this game apart. It's the part of the game that is the most fun. In addition to this, while the Behemoth is certainly scary in this context, his threat level seems to have been misjudged because, surprisingly, this is easily the easiest boss battle of the game, and certainly also the most boring. The gameplay involves the Behemoth inexplicably moving around in circles at a snail's pace while you dodge and shoot. With Spider-Man, he moved really fast. With MJ, he can barely move at all. And the thing is, you don't actually have to dodge much either. I wasn't fully paying attention here and got hit a few times as a consequence, but MJ just takes these hits in stride. She's basically invincible at this point. Add to this, a nameless villain with no personality or rivalry with the hero, in a visually bland arena, and you have easily the worst boss battle of the game, and honestly, I understand why you wouldn't even put it on a list. It is barely a boss battle at all. Sandman is the tutorial fight of the game and does a pretty great job at that, teaching first-time players to swing, shoot webs, fight hordes of enemies, and air combat, while not feeling too slow for return players, all while having two separate sections where you play as each Spider-Man, and it's technically the only boss battle to switch between the two. There is also the Venom boss battle at the end of the game, but because of a lot of cutscenes between them, the change of playable character, and arena, I decided, for this list, to count them as two different boss battles. The gameplay of this boss battle involves a lot of air combat, which is fun, but not exactly all too challenging. You have to dodge what Sandman throws at you while hitting him with falling debris. You're then sent into a short run through a building, followed immediately by fighting some Sandmen. Fighting these Sandmen is kind of just like fighting normal people, but a little bit less satisfying to defeat, because they kind of just fade away instead of being knocked out. This section also acts as the game's combat tutorial, meaning, especially for return players, there's no difficulty level at all. You then basically repeat the gameplay you've done so far, but now with Miles, which I say is when the boss actually gets a little bit better. It's not any more difficult, but it's certainly more satisfying to electrocute Sandman than simply hitting him as Peter. You also then fight Sandmen as Miles, which is also a little bit more satisfying than with Peter because it turns them into crystals, which is a bit cooler than just fading away. Still, you then return to fighting the Sandmen as Peter, and at that point, it's become a bit boring. I was sick of it. All of that is to say that the gameplay of this boss is good for a tutorial fight, but nothing really more than that. I would also say the same for Sandman himself as a villain. His dialogue is decent, while his rivalry with the Spider-Man isn't really there. Easily the best thing about this boss, and what carries it, is the visuals. Sandman's skill, the crystallization of himself in the Sandman, the sandstorms, and the lightning generated from them, and the parts of the fight where you get hit all across the city, makes this visually spectacular as a boss fight, and a great introduction to the game. The main Miles exclusive side mission ends in one final Mysterium where you face Mysterio himself, actually not for the first time, but in the first boss battle. I don't really like Mysterio's skull design, nor do I like the super underwhelming, really lame if you think about a reveal, that Quentin Beck is indeed good, and the masterminds behind all of this are two random women who have like 5 appearances each in the comics, and were never villains, but also one of them isn't even affiliated with Mysterio. They're a Fantastic Four character. The gameplay involves swinging through through a snow globe version of New York, which is a visually fantastic arena, especially when Mysterio presents himself as towering over you, showing an impressive scale. You proceed to dodge Mysterio's blast and take him out in air combat, which is some of my favorite types of combat in the game. Following that, you fight hordes of green guys who act as normal bad guys, which is nothing special. This is followed by a chase sequence through yet another great looking set piece. This mirror dimension-like illusion looks fantastic. You're then given a bit of doubt as to whether this is actually Beck doing this before being put back into this deceptively easy Mysterio air combat fight. The best part of the boss battle comes right after, where you're tricked into thinking it's over, only for you to run into a never-ending corridor as you run around in circles, which reminded me of the game-breaking Scarecrow thing from Arkham Asylum, although not to the same extent. The final section introduces a new arena that, while not as visually interesting, is surrounded by a really nice-looking broken glass void that more than makes up for it. The combat at this point starts out as more air combat, followed by some relatively easy to dodge lasers and one final punch. It's not the most difficult or innovative fight, but it's mostly made up for with fantastic visuals. I will say also, the suit unlocked from this boss gave us my personal favorite Miles suit of the game, so I guess there's that. The best side mission boss battle, coming from what is easily and by far the best side mission of the game, is Wraith, propped up greatly by the very well built up and now fully paid off relationship between Peter and Yuri in the first game, the DLC, and this side mission, as well as the no-killing conflict of the story, as Yuri makes some great points. She even turns out to be absolutely right about this particular psychopath, and as a result of this, the interactions and the dialogue of the boss battle are definitely the best part of it, as the Wraith boss is easily the worst looking Spider-Man boss with a bland environment that is made difficult to see later on due to Wraith smoke. That being said, that is also part of the boss, as it's a more personal and lower stakes hand-to-hand combat fight involving a lot of impossible to dodge and difficult to parry heavy attacks that become more difficult due to that smoke in the second section, where it's more difficult to see. Basically, this fight is the opposite of the Mysterio one, visually bland, difficult, and with a very well handled enemy who has great dialogue. I do think that what this boss battle does is more important than what the Mysterio one does well, hence it's the best side mission boss of the game. I will also say though, the suit unlocked from this boss isn't great, although it doesn't really matter that much. Finding itself disappointingly low on the list is the final boss of the game, Venom vs. Miles, which really should not have been the final boss of the game. Miles and Harry/Venom's rivalry has been underdeveloped at this point. It's a far less satisfying last fight than if the Venom fights were reversed, not to mention that the Venom fights are only 2 sections each, and this one wasn't very difficult, so it didn't feel very long, and how this part of the game forces Miles' awful evolved suit, and you have a relatively disappointing fight, even visually because of that suit. Still though, while disappointing for a final boss, it's not bad. It's not at the bottom of the list. Venom is appropriately scary and cool looking with some fantastic venomous animations. The music of this boss battle is epic final boss music, and at the end you could even get to hit Venom as both Miles and Peter in a quick time event, which I thought was really cool. The first section's combat switches between some fantastic air combat as Venom is allowed to fly with his wings and grounded hand-to-hand combat, involving a lot of dodging and parrying, although again I wouldn't exactly call it difficult. Phase 2 ups the difficulty a bit with more difficult to dodge and parry attacks as Venom yet again switches between grounded and air combat. That added difficulty, however, is not nearly enough to make this fight truly challenging, which is disappointing for the final fight, especially since a few boss battles before this were. Alongside the hero-villain rivalry, the arena is also a huge visual downgrade to Peter's fight with Venom, which was better in absolutely every way. Probably the most fun boss battle when it comes to playing as quote-unquote Bully Lowenthal. Spider-Man's aggressive comments towards the Lizard are absolutely brutal. This is more important than just being entertaining, as while the Lizard is certainly really scary and well designed, he has no dialogue, meaning the hero-villain rivalry and interactions have to be entirely carried by Spider-Man, and they absolutely are. I haven't actually checked the numbers, but this boss battle to me felt like it was the single longest one in the game, starting with a mildly difficult combat phase that goes heavy on the dodging and parrying while allowing Peter to make use of every one of his abilities. Phase 2 sees the Lizard climbing on the wall, forcing you to need to web shoot him in order to stun him, but after you do this, it pretty much just becomes the exact same grounded, parrying, and dodging heavy combat, which has become easier at this point as you've probably become a bit more accustomed to parrying Lizard's attacks, although it still is a bit challenging. Where this boss battle really shines beyond Peter's taunts is in the rapid transition from super fight to chase through the city and slide up a building, which is not difficult at all, but is appropriately long and a really nice change of pace to the boss fights while adding a very cinematic feel. Weirdly though, the boss then returns right back to the sewers with a fight that is basically identical to the first two phases, and in that regard, it's pretty repetitive and no longer really fun. However, this is the best part of the boss battle when it comes to Peter's dialogue, so there is definitely that. I would also add that in phases 1, 2, and 4, I found myself using basically all of Spider-Man's abilities, whether it be regular combat, venom powers, parrying, dodging, gadgets, or web shooters. Those uses were a lot of fun. It felt like I was using Spider-Man's entire arsenal against the Lizard. All things considered, the Lizard is a great, really long, decently difficult boss battle with good visuals and combat, and makes use of all of Spider-Man's abilities while having some of the best bully Lowenthal moments in the game. Miles' boss battle with Mr. Negative is pretty similar to the Lizard in structure, as it's pretty long with 4 phases, and phase 3 is a chase, although this boss I think does certain things better. For instance, the game did a great job of building Lee up as Miles' arch nemesis, adding a lot of weight to this fight, not to mention the idiosyncratic visuals of Lee's powers, and in particular the negative dimension of the second half of the boss. Phases 1 and 2's combat involves a lot of dodging, hitting, and ability use, which I found difficult in phase 1, but by the time you get to phase 2 and you understand Lee's attacks, they're pretty easy to dodge. This part of the fight is carried by the dialogue and visuals of Lee's powers. Phase 3 is a chase scene through a really visually interesting world with some really cool narration from Lee as well. This is a very easy phase of the boss battle, as Mr. Negative will shoot some very easy to dodge and borderline harmless attacks at you. However, it looks really good, and again, the narration from Lee is fantastic. Finally, phase 4 is a visually spectacular version of what really amounts to a normal herd of people fight, elevated greatly by Mr. Negative's arch enemy status to Miles being used very well, delving into Miles' mind using his friends, family, and insecurities against him, climaxing Miles' arc in the game. It's not the most difficult fight of the game, but it's one of the most visually and emotionally significant, which makes it mildly better than the Lizard. First and foremost, MJ being turned into Scream was an awesome twist and is used very effectively in the dialogue of the boss battle, focusing on Peter and MJ's relationship and their interpersonal struggles as MJ fully succumbs to the Scream symbiote, which also gives her a really great design. This fight takes place in the suburbs of Queens, which does fit the fight thematically, but isn't the most visually exciting arena. This is mostly made up for with the fight taking place in the rain, and the game allowing you to use any suit, and by this point of the game you should have every single one of them. The rain makes a lot of them, including my favorite one, look a lot better. Not only that, but the fight makes really good use of the environment, with certain environmental interactable objects being used in a different way to how they are typically used to deal direct damage, instead of being used to create sounds, which damage the Scream symbiote. Phases 1 and 2 are heavy on the really fast combat involving a lot of dodging and difficult to parry heavy attacks, as Scream uses her hair and even some symbiote powers in a relatively unique and fun way. These two phases are pretty much the exact same, but never really felt boring or repetitive due to the fantastic dialogue and arguments between Spider-Man and Scream. Phases 3 and 4 changed the arena to a more confined space with a little bit more sound-based interactables, making the fight more difficult and far more fun, while the great dialogue is also continued. This is a perfectly long, fast-paced boss battle with great character interactions, great villain design, good visuals, great combat, and a relatively high difficulty level. It's just a really great, very personal fight that involves a twist I did not see coming. Oh, and also, for some reason, this is the boss battle with the best music, and I do not know why. Peter's fight against Venom should have definitely been the actual final boss battle of the game for a few reasons. Peter and Harry, and also Peter and the symbiote, obviously have a far stronger connection and rivalry. This boss battle shows this off really well, in fact, through Spider-Man and Venom's dialogue. Venom's design is pretty much perfect. His powers and unique characteristics are used effectively, while anti-Venom's design also contrasts with Venom's really nicely on screen, adding to the visual element of the boss battle with the venomized, razed, destroyed high school arena with the city in the background, working really well thematically as it connects to the first mission in the game between Harry and Peter, while also just looking really nice and being far more interesting visually than Miles' fight, especially since the arena changes as you have to swing from one arena to another. The swinging from one arena to another is a part of the gameplay of the boss battle, which also includes a lot of dodging and parrying using sound-based environmental objects and anti-venom abilities, a lot of which I found to be relatively difficult, which makes this relatively short fight feel a little bit longer. In the end, this is a really fun, relatively difficult, visually stunning, emotionally significant, and climactic boss battle that really should have been the final one. While I liked a lot of what they did with Venom, it's Kraven the Hunter who is easily the best villain in this game, and also the most consistently great when it comes to boss battles, as both of his boss battles are in the top 3. Fighting as Peter in his symbiotic peak, you fight Kraven, who's really fast, super strong, and super tactical. In phase 1, Kraven uses heavy attacks to do a lot of damage and are relatively difficult to parry, as well as lightning summoning gadgets and certain disorienting attacks, all while bantering with the angriest non-shocker hunting Spider-Man ever put to screen. All things considered, the first phase is actually relatively easy. It's in phase 2 where this fight takes a huge step up. Entering a far nicer and far more fitting for the Hunt arena, Kraven begins to use the symbiote's greatest weakness against it, disorienting Spider-Man as Kraven unleashes difficult to parry heavy attacks, spear throws, and gunshots, all while fading into invisibility, becoming difficult to predict and counter, made more difficult when robot dogs show up to aid him. It's a short 2-phase fight, as there's another 2-phase boss battle right after it, but it is made up for with its difficulty level, as if you die, which I did once or twice, it'll feel way longer. This is pretty much exactly what I would have wanted from a Kraven vs. Spider-Man boss battle in this game, especially with Peter in his symbiotic peak. And speaking of Peter in his symbiotic peak, one very popular hook for this game, since it's a really unique situation where Peter becomes infected by the symbiote with Miles already around as Spider-Man, the idea of Peter being a boss battle with you playing as Miles was an absolute must, and I'd say they absolutely delivered. By the end of the Kraven boss, and all throughout the story, Peter has become absolutely terrifying, allowing for a believable lead up to him being a boss. Naturally, Miles fighting Peter is one of the most personal of the game, as Miles does his best to liberate Peter from his symbiote, as Peter's worst inner impulses and thoughts are brought to the surface. This fight acts as the emotional climax to the Bully Lowenthal story and is probably where the game peaks in terms of emotion, coupled with spectacularly epic and emotional music and some gorgeous mid-fight cutscenes that help greatly with elevating this fight to something special. Even if the gameplay wasn't that good, that's not the case either. The gameplay isn't actually anything special for a boss battle, but it's not bad. It's not nearly as difficult as the previous Kraven fight, as Peter feels a bit slower and weaker than when we controlled him, which is a bit of a bummer, and that is certainly the main reason this fight isn't number 1, because honestly, I didn't even focus on the combat while playing. The interactions, the mid-fight cutscenes especially, the emotion, the music, and the story are at their absolute peak in this boss battle, better than any other point in the game. However, it's let down a bit by the combat, meaning number 1 goes to... Aside from Peter being a boss battle, another top contender for biggest hope for this game was that Venom would be playable, and this game didn't just come through with an insane killing spree mission as Venom through Oscorp in the streets of Manhattan, but even a boss battle against Kraven, and it's gotta be my single favorite boss battle of the game. In what feels like it has the scale of what could have been a final boss battle, the two main villains of the game fight each other, made a lot better by all of Venom's gameplay up until this. You just learned Venom's abilities and powers, making the fight more difficult because of it. Combine that with Kraven's impossible to dodge and difficult to parry powerful attacks, alongside his speed and disorienting tactics, and you have what was, for me, the single most difficult boss fight in the game. Not only that, the visuals of the arena being Times Square and nightlit with fire is stunning. Kraven's dialogue is badass, as are his actions in the mid-fight cutscenes. I mean, he cuts off Venom's tongue. Venom is terrifying, and this fight perfectly acts as the bridging between main villains. For this new villain that was built up throughout the game to fight, defeat, and literally bite off the head of the villain who's been present since the beginning is such a cool concept, and is executed so well in the most brutal scene of the game by far. The fight is only 2 phases, but due to its difficulty, it really didn't feel that short, because I'll be honest, I did die a few times. Most of the boss battles of this game are good, a few are even really great. This is the only one that I'd say absolutely blew me away and is absolutely spectacular. So that brings to an end my list for every boss battle in Spider-Man 2. Let me know your thoughts and your ranking in the comments down below, and thanks for watching.